Sure. Let me ask you two questions, a two-part question here. What do you expect we'll see from the White House tomorrow, and what would you, as an economist, like to see? How much detail do you expect we'll see? How much do you think we'll see?
We're thinking that we're not going to see very much detail at all tomorrow. Mick Mulvaney said there's going to be more detail in June. Taxes are really complicated. Tax bills can be thousands of pages long, so we expect just to see kind of some very broad parameters tomorrow.
You've looked at the history at times in the past when tax reform has been brought up in earnest, when there's been healthy, robust debate about it on Capitol Hill. How is this time different from what we've seen in the past when you look at sort of the economic landscape?
And it's a really interesting question. So if you look at the last tax cuts, like in 2001 and 2003, one thing that's really different this time than last time is that the budget fiscal situation is totally different. Back in 2001, 2003, the debt to GDP ratio was less than half of what it is today. Also, when you go back to 2001, 2003, it was expected that debt to GDP ratio was going to go down. So now we have the highest debt to GDP ratio since World War II, and it's expected to worsen over the next 10 years, and it's really expected to worsen over the next 150 years. So if you're going to propose some tax cuts that are going to increase the deficit, I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to that.
Where do you we've heard President Trump say that he intends to get us to 3% growth. We heard it from the Treasury Secretary yesterday. That's his main objective in that office. How much is tax reform baked into that when you look at your model for growth? Are changes to the tax code vital to getting growth higher in the U.S.?
You know, there's lots of things you can do to boost growth a little bit. It's really hard to get growth up to 3%. One of the main reasons you can't get growth to 3%, or why it's so hard, is our population just isn't growing as fast as it used to. So back in the 90s, we get a percentage point plus just from population growth. Going ahead, it's going to be about a half a percentage point or less. So that's a real big drag. The other thing that's happening is productivity. Productivity's been really weak. So in the late 90s, you had really high productivity growth. You had these high GDP growth figures that really helped with the debt situation, as we were talking about earlier. But kind of going forward, people aren't very optimistic about productivity. So then the question is, if you're dealing with these small numbers, low population, low productivity, how do you get to high GDP growth? That's a real stretch goal.
When you think about tax reform and the prospects for it, there has been so much debate over this border-adjusted tax. Do you foresee there being tax reform without that in place? We haven't heard from the White House whether or not the White House would back that. How important a facet to a plan is the BAT?
When you think about BAT or any element of tax reform is hard. On the corporate side, the last time they did reform was in 1986. And what they tried to do in 1986 is they said, we're only going to focus on reform. We're going to try to close loopholes, and the more loopholes we close, the lower the rates that we'll get. And they made it deficit neutral because they didn't want to have that argument at all. They didn't want people to vote against it for deficit reasons, also for redistribution reasons. They just tried to do reform. So this time it's going to be harder because they're talking about reform at the same time as cutting taxes. And that's going to just make it harder to actually pass.
You have these two parallel tracks, two things being pursued at once, personal tax reform and corporate tax reform. Does that make it harder, more difficult? How does that affect the odds of this getting through? In other words, why do them both together and not independently?
So there's reasons why you want to do them through, because as an individual, you may pay taxes if you're in a limited partnership per se, or do you form a corporation? So which way do you want to be taxed? So you're going to game the system. And we see that in the data. So there's more and more people who aren't declaring themselves as corporations, and so they can pay lower taxes. So in some sense, you have to do them together. But it makes it really hard. Congress is only going to be in session for maybe 90 more days this year. And when you're talking about corporate taxes and personal taxes, both of these are really complex. Can they get it done in such a short time window? That's really tough. In 1986, it took them years to get that reform passed.
There's so much news this week. We had news about these countervailing duties on Canada, on the timber industry today. Let me just ask you about that X factor. What trade policy is going to look like in this administration? Can you read anything into what was done today as an indication of what this administration's trade policy is going to be, and how does that affect your outlook for the economy?
It's a great question because it was really bifurcated. So on the one hand, you had Trump, the campaigner, who's very aggressive on trade, talked about imposing very large tariffs on countries and on individual companies. Right? Then when he came into office, all of a sudden the language became muted. No longer was China going to be labeled a currency manipulator on day one, for instance. The negotiations with NAFTA are following an orderly process as opposed to just large tariffs being imposed. So I think the markets looked at that and they said, okay, there's going to be a more staid approach. to trade policy. And in fact, you look at the Mexican peso. It plummeted after Trump was elected, but then it's regained all the ground since then. So this action yesterday, does this mean that the more of the nationalistic populists are gaining control, or is it, this is just an aberration? So we actually think it's probably more of the aberration.
Okay.
This issue with Canada and lumber, this has been around for decades, and maybe it was accelerated a little bit to get into that 100-day window. We don't know that for sure, of course, but this issue was going to come up regardless of who was in office. It's always there.